Hello everybody, it's Miss Fincham. Today we are continuing Unit 2 by covering topic 1.4, carbon cycle. We will focus on how carbon cycles through the Earth's systems. Specifically, we'll be looking at the sinks, sources, and reservoirs of carbon and the process that moves carbon compounds between those. Thanks to Jordan Smeeds for the slides and note outlines that we use in this class. Our objective for the day is to be able to explain the steps in the reservoir interactions in the carbon cycle. Specifically, we'll be looking at the movement of carbon molecules between sources and sinks. We'll be looking at how some reservoirs are long-term while others are short-term. We'll also talk about how carbon cycles back and forth in a relatively short loop between photosynthesis and respiration in living things. Finally, we'll talk about how the burial of carbon from biomass and decomposition results in a long-term storage of carbon, whereas the digging up of these fossil fuels and their combustion results in a very short-term release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our essential skill that we'll be practicing today is explaining relationships between different characteristics of environmental concepts, and we'll do that primarily in a visual model setting with our practice FRQ. The carbon cycle is a movement of carbon-containing molecules, so primarily carbon dioxide, glucose, and methane, which is CH4, between carbon sources and carbon sinks. A really important key detail is that some steps are very quick, such as the combustion of fossil fuels. On the other hand, some steps are very slow, such as the sedimentation of decomposing organic matter, and then its burial underground and its compression into fossils. It takes a really long time for that compression to occur. We can see that in this diagram here. Imagine the shells of organic organisms or dead algae floating to the bottom of this ocean in a process called sedimentation. And then as they're compressed and buried into sedimentary rock or into fossil fuels, that's a really, really long process. Now, on the other hand, if we look at step 4, the extraction, it's really, really quick to dig up carbon and combust it, and that returns carbon to the atmosphere in the form of CO2. That's going to lead to an imbalance in the reservoirs that are storing carbon, because digging up fossil fuels and combusting them releases carbon into the atmosphere far, far faster than it's removed through sedimentation and burial. This leads to an imbalance and an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is a problem because the atmosphere is a key reservoir of carbon, but as the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, so does the global temperature. If you've heard of global warming or climate change, this is occurring because humans are increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, primarily by digging up these fossil fuels and burning them. Carbon sinks or carbon reservoirs are storing more carbon than they release. We can think of them as taking carbon out of the atmosphere. They can mitigate or reduce the effects of climate change. In the ocean, these are things like algae, which can take out carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and sediments, which store little bits of carbon in organic matter at the bottom of the ocean. On land, we have plants which also do photosynthesis and store carbon in their tissues, either in glucose or other structural compounds. We also have the soil, which can store carbon as organisms die and decompose, and their carbon is added to the soil. Carbon sources, on the other hand, are processes that release more carbon than they store, so this is going to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some of those are fossil fuel combustion. So this is oil, coal, and natural gas. We also have animal agriculture. Animal agriculture releases a lot of methane because the cows primarily, as well as other organisms that are grown for human food, are going to release a lot of methane through both their burps and their farts. Since methane is a greenhouse gas, that's also going to contribute to climate change. And finally, we have deforestation. When we cut down trees or logging or just to clear land for agriculture, the carbon dioxide that they stored is released into the atmosphere, and they don't go on storing more carbon dioxide. All of those are what we call carbon sources, which adds carbon to the atmosphere. Photosynthesis, of course, is carried out by plants, algae, and phytoplankton. It's a process where they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it to glucose. Glucose is an organic molecule. It is created by living things, and it's a biological form of carbon. It's a storage molecule which stores energy that can be used later in the form of a sugar. This is a CO2 or a carbon sink because it's going to remove carbon from the atmosphere in increasing amounts. So as trees get taller, they're incorporating more and more carbon into their bark, into their roots, and into their other structures. This means you can think of those trees as just continually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and into a carbon sink. Cellular respiration is something that all living things do. One common misconception is that it's only animals. Another misconception is that it's just breathing. Breathing is just the act of pulling air into your lungs, and that's not the same thing as respiration. Cellular respiration is a process where organisms actually use up oxygen that they breathe into their lungs or take into their body in some other way, and they break down glucose to release energy. That energy can fuel their movement, it can fuel their growth, but that's the key of cellular respiration. You're breaking glucose, which remember has that carbon from the atmosphere, to release energy because this process releases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We call it a carbon source, but it's very important to understand that both of these processes happen very quickly, and both of these processes balance each other out. If you look at the equation in green, we have photosynthesis releasing oxygen and producing glucose. If we look down at the equation in blue for respiration, organisms are going to take in oxygen and glucose, and they're going to give off CO2, which plants then take back in to create glucose. With these processes balancing each other out, we call this no net increase in atmospheric carbon, because the carbon that's being produced by animals through respiration is taken up by plants to produce glucose. Think of these as a short-term cycle where the carbon is just kind of looping back and forth between plants and animals. We're not really increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because these processes are relatively balanced. The carbon cycle also goes back and forth between the ocean and the atmosphere. Direct exchange in this section, where carbon dioxide actually just moves back and forth directly between the ocean and the atmosphere. It can dissolve as a gas right into the ocean and then can dissolve right back into the atmosphere. It's very quick and it occurs in roughly equal directions. As we saw with photosynthesis and cellular respiration, those processes resulted in basically balanced amounts of carbon dioxide. The direct exchange of the ocean and the atmosphere is a problem as it relates to global climate change, because as we see an increase in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're also going to increase the carbon dioxide levels in the ocean. Carbon in the ocean leads to ocean acidification. This means that the ocean becomes more acidic, and that can have consequences for the organisms that live there. If you look at this diagram that's going to show this direct exchange, where carbon dioxide can move from the atmosphere directly into the ocean, and then directly out of the ocean right back into the atmosphere. And again, we call this direct exchange. Now that carbon dioxide in the ocean can be taken up by the algae and the phytoplankton, so they'll take the CO2 and they'll convert it into sugars via photosynthesis. So that's one way that the carbon dioxide can be taken out of the ocean. We also have coral reefs and other marine organisms that create shells. They're going to take CO2 out of the ocean as well in order to make their shells, which are made of calcium carbonate. Since they use the carbon in calcium carbonate, they're going to have to take that carbon out of the ocean, so they're going to represent a carbon sink in the ocean. This means that they can remove some of the CO2 added to the ocean by the atmosphere and use it to make necessary structures to protect themselves. Sedimentation is the process when marine organisms die, such as coral or fish or shellfish. The remains are going to sink to the bottom of the ocean floor, and over time, all of the pressure of that water above will smash these organisms down as tiny little pieces that we call sediments. Then Burial is a process where the sediments over long periods of time, and we're talking thousands if not millions of years, get compressed by all of the pressure of that water in the ocean above them to form sedimentary rock. These are things like limestone and sandstone because they take so long to form that we call them long-term carbon reserves. Burial, extraction, and combustion are all processes that help move carbon through the carbon cycle. Remember that burial is a very slow geological process that involves rocks. Burial is going to store carbon in underground sinks like sandstone or even fossil fuels. So the process is that sediments, a little bit of rock or dead organic matter, will be compressed in a sedimentary rock or fossil fuel by the pressure of overlying water or rock layers. Think about little bits of organic matter just getting kind of pressed together over and over for millions of years, and eventually they actually form a new substance, which is either a sedimentary rock or, in this case, a fossil fuel. Fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas are also formed through the process of burial and sedimentation. The fossilized remains of organic matter, especially dead ferns, or if we're talking about oil in the ocean, marine organisms like algae and phytoplankton, get compressed by those overlying water or rock layers until they actually are compressed together to form these fossil fuels. If we take a look at the diagram here, we can see again organic matter in the ocean, such as fish or plants, get broken down over time to form organic sediments, and then as those are compressed by the amount of water that's over top of them or by rock layers, they form fossil fuels such as oil and natural gas. Extraction is the digging up through mining of those fossil fuels and then burning them for energy, which releases CO2 into the atmosphere through combustion. When you put gasoline in your car lights it on fire to make your car go, which is a great form of energy, but it releases a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. The big takeaway from the carbon cycle is that burial takes a long time. The formation of fossil fuels takes millions of years. So it's a very long-term carbon reservoir. But then the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels happens very, very quickly, which results in CO2 being put into the atmosphere far faster than it can be taken out. Our practice FRQ for topic 1.4 will cover the skill of explaining relationships between characteristics of environmental concepts, specifically using a visual representation. There's a heavy emphasis on using visual models in AP Environmental Science, and you need to identify a process in this diagram that happens very quickly and one that happens very slowly. Then you need to explain how the rate at which fossil fuels are transferred into the atmosphere, as shown in this diagram, has altered the carbon cycle during the past 250 years. Think about a process in this diagram that has changed dramatically over the past 250 years and explain how the rate of that process is altering the carbon cycle. As always, scan your notes using CamScanner and submit them to Canvas to be graded. I am giving 1 point extra credit on every assignment that is turned in using CamScanner.